I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source with Writer World's exotic traveler and truth-teller, Pico Iyer. You've been the Dalai Lama's friend from your boyhood, Pico. You've been our friend, too, in years now of reading and talk. In your new book, Aflame, subtitled Learning from Silence, I think we catch you at a turn in your thinking. Your fresh question, I think it's for all of us, might just be, how do we surface our spiritual reality, one by one, before we'll ever grasp the troubles of our world of 2025? This book is bigger than you, if I may say, Pico. There's a book here that lots of people would love to be writing called My Spiritual Awakening. In the new book, your awakening happened over the last 30 years in and out of a Benedictine monastery on the California coast at Big Sur, and you kept notes on all of it. Who knew? And who else did it? Who led you to Big Sur and this contemplative life?
Necessity led me there, and the fates and the heavens led me there, because, as you probably remember, I'm so happy to be talking to you again, Chris, continuing our conversation of 20 years. Suddenly, one day, 34 years ago, in my home in California, I looked up. I saw our house was encircled by 70-foot flames, and by the end of that evening, we'd lost our family home and every last thing in it. And so, for many months thereafter, I was sleeping on a friend's floor, as my mother and I slowly reconstructed our lives. And another friend saw me on this floor, and he said, "Come on, Pico, you can do better than this." And he told me, as a school teacher, how he took his students every spring up to a retreat house, 3.5 hours up the California coast. And he said, even the most fidgety, phone-addicted, distractible 15-year-old Californian boy only had to spend 3 days in silence, and something cooled down and cleared out in him to the point where my friend said many of these boys never wanted to come back home. They had found, I think what you were saying, some truth and some part of themselves that they had forgotten, which is perhaps all that they could use as they're dealing with the chaos of the accelerating world. So, almost against my wishes, I made that 3.5-hour drive. I stepped into the silence of this Benedictine monastery, and instantly, I actually felt liberated, partly from little Pico and his chatter and his anxieties and all the stuff I was carrying in my head driving along the highway up there.
It's so interesting because you become, in this process, a different character in our heads. We've joked over the years about seeing you, the famous you, over the decades as a sort of one-man global village, a mix of cultures in your head, in perpetual motion at 30,000 feet roughly, elements of Brahmin India, growing up in Oxbridge, England, in a household where the Dalai Lama actually keeps dropping in, friend of the family. Add in a Harvard education and a Japanese wife, and for years now, an observation post on the world in rural Japan. But a lot of that is suspended, overtaken now in the Pico Iyer we're meeting for 2025. He's driven by the mind, I think, of a Christian contemplative monk, more Thomas Merton than Dalai Lama maybe. And the big urge is to stop moving altogether and to go silent until a new dawn breaks, partly because somehow you know that a new dawn is coming.
Yes, and I think all the movement you and I have spoken about and people have witnessed is really just the surface of my life. And it's only possible by the fact that, as you said, for 34 years now, I've been spending so much of my life in silence. And I think travel is only as good as the stillness that lies under it. And words are only as deep as the silence that lies below them. And I loved it when you said this book is more Thomas Merton than the Dalai Lama, because I think contemplation is the place where Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama and you and I all meet. The distinctions and ideologies and the ways we define ourselves fall away. And when we're in our deepest selves, I don't think it matters if you're Buddhist or Christian or nothing at all. You're essentially attuned to the same reality on the far side of our ideas and our beliefs. And of course, as you know, Chris, one of the things that so touched and surprised me about this experience was I'm not a Christian, and yet these deeply devout Benedictine monks open their hearts and their doors to me and anybody who comes there. They're the least dogmatic people I know. They're less dogmatic than I and most of my friends are, because they know that the name we put on our experience is much less important than the experience themselves. And so there were probably 15 people on retreat at any given point in this Benedictine hermitage. Probably the majority are women. I'd say many of them are Buddhists or Sufis or nothing at all. But the Catholic monks know that each person in the silence will find what really sustains them and will find precisely what gets lost in the rush and distraction of modern life. And you were saying, I think perfectly, that this isn't a book about me, but it may be a book about the times for two reasons, perhaps. I've never seen my friends so despairing as they are right now, and I've never seen the nation and the world as divided as it is right now. And so that's why after 34 years, I thought this is the time to speak about this truth that all of us sense, but sometimes lose along the way, that is, as I say, beyond our divisions, and that actually offers a certain degree of hope and light and inspiration at a time when we're so terrified about what the world is bringing to us. And most of all, maybe brings us clarity and calm, which are the two main principles I find among my monk friends.
You lean on this word contemplation because it would be my goal for this conversation, Pico, to unlock that word, contemplation. It's what monks do. It's not to be equated with thinking exactly. It's not calculating or counting. And it's a process that does change people, and we'll get to that. But I've been getting lots of hints, as you do, of this unhappiness and of this striving and a certain guess that it's somewhere in our spirit consciousness, as opposed to mind and body. There is that spirit. Some would say the Holy Spirit. I met a man coming out of Mass this past Sunday who fit the description. He was sort of beside himself with a certain ecstasy after a remarkable Mass, but he said, how can I be feeling this so much better than well? He turned out to be a lawyer, probably pushing 70, a very ordinary professional appearance. But he reminded me of somebody you noted from Big Sur who had said, how many more weeks will I get to spend in this place, so joyous and so calm all at once? I mean, that's what we're chasing.
Yes, exactly. And I must say, I've made retreats more than 100 times over these 34 years. And after every one, I come out sounding just like the person you met at Mass. And many of the people who are staying in this monastery, I think, are lawyers or executives or busy real estate agents. And I think the busier you are in your regular life, the more you need to liberate yourself from that, just to see the larger picture, to put things in perspective. Because so many of us are in such a hurry, we don't realize what a hurry we're in. As you know, 70 years ago, T.S. Eliot said, where is the life we have lost in living? We're so caught up in the day-to-day, we lose sense of the eternal or something beyond the day-to-day. And this was true when I first went to this hermitage in 1991. In those days, I'd never heard of the internet. There were no smartphones. There was no social media. So what was urgent, even in T.S. Eliot's time, is 1,000 times more urgent now in our age of distraction. And to speak to two of the things you just said, I think contemplation is the opposite of thinking. I think it's the place where thinking falls away and really, as you suggested, something much deeper than our words and ideas comes forth. And when you spoke about your friend in the church who is in a state of joy...
I never knew the man, never met him before, probably will never meet him again.
Yes, the stranger, even better.
He was afloat.
Afloat. Afloat is the perfect word. And one of the main things I learned from my monk friends is that joy is the happiness that doesn't depend on circumstance. In other words, all of us can be happy when the sun is shining and we're with the people we love and the world seems at peace. But how do you find joy even when the world isn't at peace and it's stormy and we're fearful about the next moment? And I think that's what a true contemplative radiates, whether it's the Dalai Lama who is constantly laughing while going through the most difficult life I know, or whether it's these Benedictine monks whose life is constantly being imperiled by forest fires, and all they do is radiate absolute hope and confidence. So I think that joy that lies outside our circumstance, regardless of our circumstance, is just what we want. And as you said in the lines that you read, if you can feel joyful and calm at the same time, you're probably where we all want to be.
Right. Well, and then once you start noticing it, that something's afoot or in the stream of gab, it's everywhere. I noticed, for example, Nicholas Kristof, political op-ed columnist in the New York Times, all of a sudden interviewing Elaine Pagels, who wrote a historic book and now a new one on the so-called Gnostic Gospels, discovered long after the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John 4 Gospels, a different story. And then David Brooks, I never would have expected this, discovering his faith, both Catholic and Jewish. It was kind of phenomenal for this to be showing up op-ed in the resolutely secular New York Times. But then I see it in my own lively stream of Catholics in Boston, sort of reconstituting faith and the power of the sacraments in the Back Bay parish of St. Cecilia. We won't go on about that. But in any way, I've been anticipating your turn, Pico, and now your marvelous account of it. I wish you'd just give us the basics of who the monks are, how you mix with them, what you observe. Do they speak? What are they getting out of it? Who comes, who goes, who stays? The life up on the great hillside over Big Sur.
Beautiful. So these monks, there are about 15 of them. They live in the most remote area possible in the wilderness above the ocean in Big Sur, California, an hour from the nearest post office, 2.5 hours by car from the nearest hospital. They have about 10 lay people who work with them, helping with the plumbing and the generators and the like. And they have 15 rooms that they make available to anybody who wants to stay 3 days for a week. I've sometimes stayed there for 3 weeks. And when the retreat rooms are full, they're actually kind enough to allow me to stay with them in their enclosure. And I think one of the beautiful things for me about going there was instantly to be freed from all my stereotypes and preconceptions about monks, because they're not necessarily unworldly people. They're very busy, looking after one another and taking care of their guests. They're a remarkably talented group of chemists, scholars, engineers, painters, musicians. They also belong to this Camaldolese congregation, which is the single most contemplative congregation within the Catholic Church, which has actually been deputed by the Vatican to interact with other traditions, following the Vatican II notion that nothing that is true and holy in any tradition is alien to us, the Catholic Church. We want to learn from everyone. And so remarkably, these deeply Catholic souls go and teach at the Zen temple across the hills. In the little pamphlet that greets you when you step into your cell, they tell you that the father of monasticism is the Buddha, and they cite the Rig Veda from Hinduism, and they actually maintain a Catholic Hindu ashram in southern India, where the Catholic priest wears a dhoti, sleeps on the floor, eats with his hands. And the motto of that ashram is, we are here to awaken from the illusion of separateness. And I've always loved that. The illusion of separateness is what makes our problems in our world and in our head. If we can awaken from that, we'll be better off. So I love the motto. And then I found it actually came from the Vietnamese Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh. So here are some Catholics who are ready to take their maxim from a Vietnamese Buddhist. There are no rules in the place, so those of us who go, really free to do anything. There's no pressure to attend the services, though 5 take place in the beautiful chapel every day. Some people do seek out the monks for spiritual counsel, but they're happy to allow you just to take a walk, to read, or to do what's hardest of all, usually, which is nothing at all. They're very gregarious and fun to spend time with, and when I stay with them in the enclosure, they're watching John Cleese movies on Sunday nights, and they're actually much more down to earth than I am. I'm the one who's afloat and up in the air, and they're working hard on accounts and fixing the road and getting the groceries.
Do they laugh out loud at John Cleese?
Oh, they laugh at everything. And one time I watched Henry IV Part 2 with 2 of the monks. And as you were saying in your introduction, I studied English literature for 8 years. Actually, I know Shakespeare pretty well. These guys knew it inside out. They could notice every line that was missing, all the different changes of interpretation. They know everything. And, they're very funny. So I'd say to them, I'm really worried there are mountain lions around. And they say, don't worry, just make sure you don't look like a deer. Or they'd say, hey, Pico, how are you doing? Are you having a good time? And I say, yeah, I'm having a very good time. Oh, don't worry, we can take care of that. I mean, they couldn't be more immediate and human.
That answers one big question. They do talk and you do converse.
They do talk. As I say, they really have no rules. And when I stay in their enclosure, I have lunch with them every day and meet them as I'm walking to their library and all the time. But the rest of the time, too, you see them walking along the beautiful monastery road, talking to visitors who are in need of guidance and wisdom. I think the thing about monks I've noticed, whether the Dalai Lama or surely Thomas Merton, is they're the least pious of people. They're not defensive, holding on to a certain belief, because they're so deep in their belief that they're, as it were, spontaneous and free. And I was so glad you mentioned that conversation between Nicholas Kristof and Elaine Pagels, because Elaine Pagels and I are friends, and one of the things we often talk about is that the Christian tradition has so much to offer, even though the church is by necessity a human and imperfect place. You know, one of the things that I had to get through when I went up to the monastery is that I went through 15 years of intense Anglican schooling in England. So we had chapel every morning, chapel every evening, the Lord's Prayer in Latin on Sunday nights, the Gospel according to Matthew in Greek in the daytimes. And so when I emerged from that, I thought, you know, I've had a lot of the Christian tradition. I want to learn from Buddhism and Islam and elsewhere. And thereby I was overlooking this great treasure. And it was only by going and staying with the Catholics that suddenly I was reminded I don't have to look across the world for wisdom. It's right here in Meister Eckhart and Thomas Merton and Richard Rohr and the Cloud of Unlearning. There's a treasure lode of Christian wisdom that sometimes we tend to overlook because it's too familiar, or because we know that the church isn't everything that Jesus might have wished, but that doesn't mean that Jesus ever did anything wrong. It's just that we can't live up always to the example that he set.
Pico, there are so many wonderful conversations out of your notes in the book, and I just want to touch on a few of them. Your question, I presume, to somebody, what is so special about this place? And the answer came, strange, how rich it feels to be cleansed of all chatter in this place, hidden at the heart of the world. Also, somebody observing, one hears in the monastery, one does not seek. I love this question, how has your time in silence changed you? The answer, coming here gave me the courage to die. I went home and I quite literally died to the life I had known. This is remarkable.
It is remarkable. That's a monk who is saying that to me. And one of the things that was very moving, because I've got to know these monks very well, we've grown old together, over 34 years together. And so some of them will come to my little trailer on the hill and share with me their doubts, their fears, their frustrations. And what really strikes me is the courage of their living day in, day out for life with this deep commitment in which often they're alone in the cell, and maybe God is absent for a while, or suddenly there's no answer to their questions, and there's nowhere for them to run, nowhere to hide. I remember a Zen teacher once said, a Zen student is somebody who sits on his cushion next to the abyss. And what I feel about these monks is they're the real counterculturalists and revolutionaries, brave enough to live right at the edge of the wilderness with the deepest questions and not flinch and not run away from them. In answer to what you were just saying, I think if I were to describe the place, the most essential thing, and I've found this in every convent and monastery I visited across the globe in any order, is that the silence isn't just an absence of noise, it's really a presence. And I think it's that presence that has been created by years of prayer or meditation. It's almost like a series of transparent glass walls. And when I get out of my car and I step into the silence, I'm stepping into something positive and alive, not just into the quiet you would get on top of a mountain or in a forest. And that's, I think, the result of what monks and nuns create. And to speak to the sentence you just read, you know, when I first went there, I went as many of us might, and I thought, I want to learn how to live. These guys are professionals at learning how to live. And then the longer I spent there, I realized that their lives are basically about love, about caring for everybody else and of their commitment to obedience and service. And I thought, this is a place where I could learn how to love. And then as the years went on and I got older, I thought, well, this is actually a place where, as with all monastics, I would learn how to die. And then the final part of it is, no, this is a place where I could learn that even more difficult lesson, what to do with the dying when the people you care for are falling away. And one of the very touching things about this precariously located monastery is that 7 of the last 8 years, it's been completely cut off from the world. 3 times by winter storms, 2 times by wildfire, and 2 times by COVID. And so when these often elderly monks fall ill, they have to be helicoptered out, and the prior has to drive 5 hours along a back road through the dark just to sit all night with them in the hospital. And just that image of absolute unthinking care, which I think is what we're most crying out for in this world when we're much more aware of people speaking through megaphones and saying, I believe this and I know more than you. To see people living with such humility and surrender, I think that reminds me this is how I should be living, and these are the priorities I should be honoring. And it's the most important thing I could have in this confused time, I'd say.
Also, Pico, the matter of distinguishing solitude from abandoning people or giving up that. The mandate of this particular tradition in the Benedictine order is to deepen community, which is to say social life and dependence in a certain way, or help or care, through the fruits of solitude. One of the monks described his goal to you as giving up family and friends and his own ideals, truly to give myself over to the community, he said. How does that work when you give up one's deepest self, including family, for the community, for the spirit of wholeness there?
I think that's what all monks and nuns do, and it's the most humbling and heroic of renunciations. They will live entirely for themselves. And that was a really big lesson I had to learn, because as you probably know, I'm an only child. I've chosen to be a writer, so I spend most of my day alone. I love being alone. So suddenly to be in a beautiful room above the Pacific Ocean in Big Sur by myself, free to do anything, seemed like heaven. And then I realized, as you were saying, that the solitude was only a gateway to a deeper understanding of community and compassion, and that the monks in their enclosure were the opposite of solitude because they're spending their whole time looking after each other and looking after all their guests. So actually, it changed my life dramatically. And in one way, I had always thought, I love being alone. As you said earlier, I love traveling. I can sit at my desk all day when I'm not traveling. But spending time there actually moved me to get married, which I don't think I ever would have done otherwise. And it moved me to come here and live in this tiny rented 2-room apartment with my wife and formerly our 2 kids, because it showed me that solitude is only as useful as what you can bring back to the world, whether it's when I drive down from the monastery and I feel refreshed and much more liable to offer something fresh to my friends and family, or whether it's actually making the kind of commitment that I might not have made otherwise. One thing you will have noticed, Chris, though not everybody would, is that you just cited Nietzsche, who pronounced the death of God, but who nonetheless saw the wisdom of contemplation. And in this book, I made a great point of quoting a series of contemplatives who are not necessarily associated with one religious tradition. Henry Miller, Emily Dickinson, the heroic Jewish woman Etty Hillesum, Camus, Nietzsche, our old friend, Henry David Thoreau. So all of them are not necessarily defined by a single church, but they're coming to the same truth that every Catholic monk or every Buddhist monk does. As you can tell, probably, one of the things that appeals to me about silence is it's non-denominational. It's available to everybody. And if somebody listening to this program feels, well, I don't have a religion, I'm not comfortable with a religious community, that doesn't exclude her from the fruits of contemplation, which is something as universal as breathing or as sleeping. And if our lives are without contemplation, I suppose my biggest fear now is that the external world is so loud, it's drowning everything out, and we can't hear the internal world. And the internal world and the interior landscape is really the only resource we have. My question for myself is, what do I have to bring to the ICU when suddenly my mother has a stroke and I have to be with her in the hospital, or when suddenly I fall ill? What's going to help me then? Not my resume. My bank account's going to be of minimal help. The books I've written, no use at all. The only thing I can bring to the many times when reality makes a house call, I think, is what I've gained in silence. And again, the wise Christian Meister Eckhart, 600 years ago, said, as long as the inner work is strong, the outer work will never be puny. Your relationships, your career, your relation to yourself, that can take care of itself so long as you've taken care of the inner landscape. And that's what's actually being imperiled now, because the outer is so overwhelming. As you and I are talking, there are 16 updates and 20 new news bulletins from CNN, and we can't hear ourselves think.
Notifications, dare I say?
Notifications, updates, upgrades, exactly. Yeah, too many.
Pico, what's the monastic effect on your writing, do you suppose? The solitude, but also contemplation.
Without question, that undistracted silence is the most creative place in my life. So even when I'm driving up, I have nothing I need to write or say. And I step into my cell and almost instantly, magnetically, I go to the long desk and I start scribbling things I didn't know I have inside of me. And it's interesting. Something that made a big impression on me 30 years ago was when I drove up into the high, cold, dark mountains behind Los Angeles and met Leonard Cohen when he was living for 5.5 years as a Zen monk. And we all know the beautiful, deep work that emerged from that monastic time for him. But what really struck me, he was 61 at that time. He'd been a global celebrity for 30 years. He could be doing anything in the world with anyone in the world. And he said, this is the deep and voluptuous and profound excitement of life. This is the great adventure, sitting still in contemplation, following orders, and in his case, shoveling snow and scrubbing floors. And when somebody who has tasted all the pleasures of the world says the ultimate pleasure is contemplation, it makes a big impression on you.
Go back to that rather amazing cast of characters in your book, some who've been to Big Sur, but a lot haven't. Henry Miller caught my eye, famous in some way pornographer, Tropic of Capricorn and Cancer, but a deeply important writer. Orwell thought he was the great writer of the 20th century. But in any event, it turns out he had a big correspondence over the years with Thomas Merton, and they had lots of things to talk about. What was Henry Miller looking for in contemplation, and what did he find, do you suppose?
He found everything he needed. And I honestly think that he was the 20th century heir to the great transcendentalists you and I have spoken about so often, Thoreau, Emerson, and Whitman. And as you said, Henry Miller began his days stumbling around the gutters of Paris, talking to ladies of the night and much else. But then, just as the war was breaking out, as you probably know, he traveled around Greece in a book called The Colossus Marousi.
Absolutely.
And he found gods in every corner. And right after that, he moved to what I think of as the Greece of the New World, which is the Big Sur coastline, living simply in a convict's cabin, having to walk 1.5 miles every time he wanted to get some water or his mail. So he was living just 20 minutes north of the monastery where I stay. And as you say, wow. Thomas Merton and he shared a publisher. And so they started writing to one another. And Thomas Merton, the most open-minded of souls, said of Henry Miller, whom some might see as a pornographer, "You have a basic Christian spirit that I wish more Christians had." He recognized that Henry Miller was essentially on the same path that he, Thomas Merton, was. Although the names that they carry, the definitions that we associate with them might be different, essentially they were on the same contemplative path. Because anyone who's been to Big Sur, California, which is this undeveloped 60-mile stretch of coastline where there's nothing except the wide ocean, high redwoods and tall cliffs, knows that the human becomes very tiny there. And it's hard not to become Henry David Thoreau or Whitman when you're sitting on those cliffs.
Speak of Camus. You quote him, or he says somewhere, writing about the plague that can awaken heroism and compassion, isolation in short, but because, he said, we are no longer sleepwalking. Imagine how that worked, that coming to consciousness. Again, the fruits of contemplation.
The fruits of contemplation, which I think at some level most of us experienced during the pandemic for all its sorrows and horrors. Many of us found ourselves making an inadvertent retreat, staying at home, not moving a lot, and in the process suddenly remembering what was important to us, whom we really cared about, and how we should be living. And of course, once the pandemic lifted, we were back in our old habits, at least I was. But there was that moment where, freed of distractions and stuck at home, suddenly we became contemplatives, I think many of us, and began to think, what is the most essential thing in life, and what should I be living for? And what have I lost and missed out on when I'm racing to the office and spending my whole life on the freeway? And so in Camus' story, the plague is sort of an example of where tragedy suddenly brings a sense of fellow feeling and awakens the possibility for heroism that isn't always so apparent when things are going smoothly.
I spoke of you at the start as a truth seeker, a truth teller, Pico, and I wasn't just trying to flatter you. We seem to have fewer and fewer who just speak their mind and damn the consequences.
I know, because the consequences are so everywhere now, and every word any of us speaks is there in the public domain, and none of us speaks impeccably. One of the things my book is about, and that I've come to see, is I feel that what we believe is much less important than what we do. And so, for example, in this case, I don't happen to share the specific beliefs of the monks who have been so kind to me, but they've taught me how to act in a better way. And I'm so moved by the selflessness of their actions. And it's interesting that you may know that the Dalai Lama, as often says, that he feels that his Tibetan monks, because they've been so isolated from the world for many centuries, are quite accomplished when it comes to meditation. But he tells his Tibetan monks, when it comes to social action, social justice, caring for the suffering and oppressed, you need to learn from your Christian brothers. And he feels that the Christians really have this grand tradition alive to this day of going out to Africa, going out to the streets of Baltimore, going wherever people are in need and extending themselves. And that's really what any life is about, ultimately. And I think that's a part of the Christian tradition that sometimes we forget about living in the West, and it takes a Tibetan to remind us these guys are doing heroic work. And I think Nicholas Kristof mentioned it in his talk with Elaine Pagels. The news always concentrates on the people in the church who are not living up to its highest standards. And yet, wherever you go in the world, you see the church doing remarkable, selfless things in the great tradition of Dorothy Day and so many others.
Come back to this mystery word contemplation and its breaking through with a recognizable gift. I'm thinking of Thomas Merton, among other things, writing about John F. Kennedy, and he was desperately worried. He thought Kennedy was marked for death. He thought he was a good man fundamentally, a brilliant man in certain respects, but not a contemplative type of the sort who would see the larger picture, including the dangers to himself. I wonder what's your favorite example of a kind of insight and truth, difficult, complex, unwelcome truth that comes only through that sort of process of contemplation, thinking and thinking again.
Yes. I mean, I think the heart of contemplation is you leave yourself behind. It's about the repudiation of ego. You have no more concern with little Chris or little Pico, but as you said, you're part of some much larger understanding of the world, and your sense of how to define success changes radically. In my case, contemplation reoriented my values and priorities, and I realized, bringing out lots of books and decorating my resume, that's not really going to make me a richer, deeper person in the long while. Spending quiet time in the middle of Japan might well do that. And as we've been saying, it's hard to find that in the public domain. When you talk about JFK, I thought President Obama was much closer to the act of contemplation than many, but I think his challenge was a very nuanced, mature, balanced vision of the world as he had, doesn't play so well in this age of instant answers and extreme voices. And that people's quarrels with him was that he was too balanced and too measured in his way. But I thought that was the fruit of his taking a detached and clear vision of the world. And he was certainly our most global leader for a long time. So in that sense, he had a good sense of the larger picture.
Can you imagine, Pico, a culture of contemplation, a habit of contemplation, an expectation of contemplation coming out of our television sets that would begin winning a sort of battle? Will we ever get a contemplative spirit back as the prevailing voice that we want to hear from in every discussion of big issues, war and peace and rights and who we are?
It's really hard, Chris, because the world, as you know, is moving so quickly in the opposite direction. But I think at some level, every one of us suddenly finds TV and social media isn't giving us what we need. And it's at those moments when suddenly we're in the ICU ourselves or with somebody we care about. We're realizing, all those feeds aren't helping us. What is? And suddenly we realized we need something beyond CNN and the New York Times and TMZ in our lives. When you talk about a society of contemplation, I voted with my feet because, as you know, when I was 29, I left an exciting life in Midtown Manhattan to come to live here in Japan. And I chose Japan because it was the most quiet, most contemplative, most inward-looking society I had found on my travels. And it's a very imperfect society, for sure, and not everybody in this neighborhood is free from social media or TV by any means. But I think because it's been around for 1,600 years, thinking about how to deal with plague and warfare and forest fire, it does have a sense of a larger self, that people are less caught up in their own individual destinies and much more thinking of the larger whole. And that's already a step in the right direction, I feel. That's why I live here.
Pico Iyer, when are you going back to the hermitage at Big Sur? And can you take other people with you? Or can you send them ahead or behind you?
Everybody is welcome there, even though the road is often washed away. I already have my next reservation. And honestly, that's what really has made a difference in my life, which is that even as I'm sitting here in Japan, the memory of the 100 retreats I've made, the prospect that I can go back and claim that medicine again, and it's just up the road from my mother's house, it changes my days. However scared and rattled I am, and I often am, I know that there's a place where I can at least get refuge. When my father suddenly went into the hospital and died, and it was a very busy time and I didn't know what to do, I realized, and if I just drive up there for 4 hours, sit quietly in that silence for 2 hours and come back down, I'll be ready to deal with the world. So as long as you know that medicine is nearby, it makes the challenges of every day much less stressful. And when you ask wonderfully whether I can take you or anybody else, I should say that when I first began staying there, I remember one day I went down to the payphone at the bottom of the hill and I called my then girlfriend in Japan. And I was saying, there are poppies everywhere and the ocean is right below me and there's tolling bells. She could hear the heaven in my voice. And she got more and more rattled. And then she said, if you met another woman, no problem. I could defeat her. But how can I compete with a temple? And it was such a good question. It went right through me. And the very next season, I made a lifelong commitment to her. But now my wife joins me. So the two of us both go to the hermitage. And though a good Buddhist lady from Kyoto, Japan, comes and attends the mass and sits in the trailer and understands that this is just another way of what you would find meditating in a temple in Kyoto. So everybody is welcome, and nobody has ever been turned away from that place or the many places nearby. There are many in Massachusetts, or wherever people happen to be listening. There are such retreat houses with their doors flung open wherever you turn.
How many monasteries can we sample?
There are hundreds. I remember that a nice book came out 30 years ago on retreat houses all around the United States. I was just in one in New Mexico. And one of the almost startling things is how little the monks ever ask. So when I first went there, they would offer me a trailer on the hill above the ocean with a beautiful ocean view, kitchen, bathroom, everything I could want, and the most beautiful stretch of coastline. And they said, would you mind paying us $25 a night? So really, there's no reason not to go. And if anyone thinks I don't have time to take 3 days off, I would say if you're saying that, it means you definitely need to take those 3 days off, and you will never regret. Whatever form that takes, go to your nearest convent, monastery, retreat place.
Pico Iyer, you've given us a wonderful conversation, but also a wonderful book, Aflame, Learning from Silence, and it's all here in a couple of 100 pages. Remarkable, and it will have its effect, starting with me. This has been a wonderful treat for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. I must say, one of my great joys in life is talking to you over these many 20 years, but the other is listening to you. So I'm so happy that in my contemplative quiet here in Japan, as you know, I will listen to you talk to the most interesting people around, and it fills me up. So thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Pico. We will strive toward a new standard of contemplative conversation. We count on listener support here at Open Source. If you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest running podcast going strong. And thank you. Open Source is proud to be a member of Hub and Spoke, a collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our curiosity and of our work at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did.